Chapter 1. A Body in the Library. Miss Jane Marple was enjoying the unusually fine May morning in her garden. The herbaceous border was coming along nicely, despite the late frost they'd had last month, and the roses promised to be particularly splendid this year. She was carefully deadheading the early bloomers when the telephone's shrill ring disturbed the morning peace. With a small sigh of resignation, Miss Marple removed her gardening gloves and made her way into the cottage. It was most likely her nephew Raymond, calling to check on her as he did every Wednesday. The dear boy worried so. "Say Mary Mead free," she answered in a gentle, precise voice. "Jane. Jane, is that you?" The voice on the other end was high-pitched with distress. "It's Dolly Bantry." "Why, Dolly, whatever is the matter?" Miss Marple asked, immediately alert. Mrs. Bantry was not one for hysterics, despite what some in the village might think. "You must come at once, Jane. It's too awful. There's a body in our library. A dead body. Arthur's beside himself." Miss Marple's faded blue eyes widened slightly. "A body? Whose body?" "A young woman. Nobody we know. That's what makes it so perfectly ghastly. She's just lying there on the hearthrug. The police are on their way, but I need you here, Jane. You must come." "Of course, my dear. I'll be there directly." After quickly changing from her gardening clothes into a neat grey dress and sensible walking shoes, Miss Marple set out for Gossington Hall. The Bantry residence was only a 20-minute walk from her cottage, but today she hurried, arriving somewhat breathless at the imposing Georgian house. The drive was already cluttered with official vehicles. A police constable stood at the entrance, but he knew Miss Marple by sight and allowed her to pass once she explained that Mrs. Bantry had specifically requested her presence. She found Dolly Bantry in the drawing room, pale but composed, a cup of untouched tea at her elbow. "Oh, Jane, thank goodness," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, rising to grasp her friend's hands. "It's the most extraordinary thing. Arthur went into the library this morning to fetch a book, and there she was, sprawled on the hearthrug as if she'd been arranged there. A complete stranger in evening dress, in our library of all places." "Has Inspector Slack arrived?" Miss Marple inquired, naming the somewhat officious local police inspector. "Yes, and he's been most disagreeable about my calling you. Said we mustn't disturb anything, and that amateur interference never helped anyone. Amateur indeed. As if you haven't helped solve more puzzles than he's had hot dinners." At that moment, the door opened to admit Colonel Bantry, a tall, military-looking man with a mustache, now looking distinctly ruffled. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, mustering a weak smile. "Dolly insisted on calling you. Shocking business. Can't make head nor tail of it myself. Young woman I've never laid eyes on before, dressed fit for a dance or a dinner party, lying dead as a doornail on my library carpet." "Inspector Slack has permitted me to view the body," Miss Marple said. It wasn't a question. Colonel Bantry looked uncomfortable. "Well, no, not exactly. He's been rather firm about keeping everyone out while they photograph and measure and whatnot, but I dare say he'll be finished soon." As if on cue, the door opened again to reveal Inspector Slack, a burly man whose perpetual expression of irritation seemed to have deepened since Miss Marple had last encountered him. "Mrs. Bantry," he began, then stopped short on seeing Miss Marple. "Oh, you're here as well, are you, Miss Marple?" "Mrs. Bantry was kind enough to telephone me," Miss Marple replied mildly. She was naturally distressed. Inspector Slack's lips tightened. "This is a police matter. We don't need village gossips complicating things." "Now see here," Colonel Bantry began, his face reddening, but Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on his arm. "Of course, Inspector," she said. "I'm merely here to support my friends. It must be most upsetting to find a stranger dead in one's home." Inspector Slack's expression suggested he was not entirely convinced by this explanation, but he merely harumphed before addressing Colonel Bantry. "We'll need statements from everyone in the household, yourself, Mrs. Bantry, and all the servants. Dr. Haydock is examining the body now." "Have you identified the young woman?" Miss Marple asked softly. Inspector Slack hesitated, then apparently decided there was no harm in answering. As a matter of fact, we have. One of your housemaids recognized her, Mrs. Bantry, Lily Bennet, a lady's maid employed by Mrs. Fortescue at Gossington Lodge. Gossington Lodge, Mrs. Bantry said with surprise. But that's on our estate, the Dower House. We've only just let it to Mrs. Fortescue 3 months ago. Quite so, Inspector Slack replied. We'll be speaking to Mrs. Fortescue shortly. Dr. Haydock, the elderly local physician, appeared in the doorway, his face grave. He nodded a greeting to Miss Marple before addressing Inspector Slack. I've completed my preliminary examination, Inspector. The young woman has been dead between 10 and 14 hours, putting the time of death somewhere between 10 o'clock last night and 2 this morning. The cause appears to be poison, administered in liquid form. There's a faint odor on her lips that's quite distinctive. I'll know more after the autopsy. Poison? Colonel Bantry exclaimed. But that's impossible. She couldn't have been poisoned here. I was in the library until 11 last night, reading by the fire. There was certainly no body there when I locked up and went to bed. Then she was placed there afterward, Inspector Slack said grimly. Which means someone has a key to your house, Colonel. Miss Marple coughed delicately. Might I ask, Inspector, has anything been removed from the library? Not that we can determine, Miss Marple. This doesn't appear to be a burglary gone wrong, if that's what you're suggesting. No, I wasn't suggesting that at all. I was merely wondering about the young woman's appearance. Was she fully dressed? Was anything missing or out of place? Inspector Slack looked as if he might refuse to answer, but Dr. Haydock intervened. The young woman was wearing an evening gown of blue silk, quite elaborate and expensive looking. Her makeup was expertly applied, and her hair was styled for an evening out. Nothing appeared to be disarranged except... He paused. Except, Miss Marple prompted. She was clutching something in her right hand, a silver hairpin with an unusual filigree design, quite ornate and old-looking, not the sort of thing you'd expect a lady's maid to possess. Miss Marple's eyes brightened with interest. How curious. And was this hairpin being used in her hair? No, Dr. Haydock replied. That's what struck me as odd. Her hair was pinned up, but with ordinary pins, plain, functional ones. This silver pin wasn't being used at all. It was simply clutched in her hand. Inspector Slack cleared his throat irritably. If you've quite finished, Doctor, we have an investigation to conduct. Miss Marple, I must ask you to leave the premises. This is now a crime scene. Of course, Inspector, Miss Marple said mildly. I was just about to suggest to Mrs. Bantry that she might benefit from a cup of tea. Such a shock, finding a body in one's home. As she guided Mrs. Bantry toward the door, Miss Marple paused. One small question, if I may, Inspector. This Mrs. Fortescue at Gossington Lodge, has she been informed about her maid? We've sent a constable to notify her, Inspector Slack replied. Not that it's any of your concern. No, indeed, Miss Marple agreed placidly. It's just that Lily Bennet was apparently dressed for an evening engagement, yet Colonel Bantry says there was no body in the library at 11 o'clock. One wonders where she spent the evening, and with whom. Before Inspector Slack could respond, there was a commotion in the hall, and a woman's voice, cultured and commanding, could be heard demanding entrance. That'll be Mrs. Fortescue now, Inspector Slack said grimly, and from the sound of it, she's not pleased. The door burst open to admit a striking woman in her 40s, expensively dressed in a fashionable suit, her blonde hair immaculately styled. She paused dramatically in the doorway, surveying the room with pale, calculating eyes. I understand my maid has been found dead in your library, Colonel Bantry, she announced without preamble. How extremely inconvenient. I was counting on her to help me dress for luncheon with Lady Denham today. Miss Marple observed the newcomer with interest, noting the perfectly manicured hands that fidgeted slightly with an expensive handbag, the artificial brightness of her smile, and, most tellingly, the complete absence of shock or grief at the news of her employee's death. Most inconvenient indeed, Mrs. Fortescue, Miss Marple murmured. Most inconvenient for poor Lily Bennet as well, I should imagine. Chapter 2. The Curious Case of Mrs. Fortescue. You'll stay, of course, Jane, Mrs. Bantry said firmly as they sat in the morning room, well away from the activity in the library. I simply won't hear of you returning to your cottage with all this going on. We have plenty of room, and frankly, I need your level head. Miss Marple smiled gently at her friend. If you're quite sure I won't be in the way, Dolly. In the way? Good heavens, no. Arthur is beside himself, pacing about and harumphing, and I'm at my wits' end trying to manage the servants. They're all in a state, as you can imagine. Finding a body in the house. Mrs. Price in the kitchen is threatening to give notice. Says she can't work in a house where murders happen. Most understandable, Miss Marple murmured, though her faded blue eyes were thoughtful. I don't suppose anyone has mentioned whether Lily Bennet was expected anywhere yesterday evening. I understand it might have been her half-day off. Oh, yes, that's right. Mary, she's our second housemaid, said that Lily had mentioned visiting her aunt in Danemouth yesterday. The maids from Gossington Hall and Gossington Lodge often chat when they meet in the village. Apparently Lily's aunt is her only living relative. How interesting, Miss Marple said, adjusting her knitting needles. Mrs. Bantry had insisted she bring her knitting from the cottage, knowing it helped her friend think. And yet she was found in evening dress, hardly suitable attire for visiting an elderly relative in a neighboring village. Before Mrs. Bantry could respond, Colonel Bantry entered the room, his face drawn with strain. That Inspector Slack is the most infuriating man, he declared, accepting a cup of tea from his wife. Asked the same questions a dozen different ways, as if trying to catch me out. Me. In my own house, as if I'd know anything about that poor girl. The police must be thorough, Arthur, Mrs. Bantry said, soothingly. Miss Marple was just asking about Lily Bennet's plans yesterday. It was her half-day off, apparently. Colonel Bantry frowned. Well, that explains why she wasn't at Gossington Lodge, but not how she ended up dead in our library, dressed to the nines. Tell me about Mrs. Fortescue, Miss Marple suggested, her needles clicking steadily. She's a relatively new arrival to St. Mary Mead, isn't she? Mrs. Bantry's eyes lit up with the opportunity to gossip about the village's most intriguing resident. She arrived about 3 months ago, causing quite a stir. Rented Gossington Lodge immediately, without even haggling over the price. Paid 6 months in advance. She's from London originally, I believe, though she mentioned having lived abroad for some years. A widow, so she says. So she says? Miss Marple inquired mildly. Colonel Bantry harumphed. Dolly means that Mrs. Fortescue's accounts of her late husband vary somewhat depending on who she's speaking to. Told Lady Denham he was in shipping, told me he was in the diplomatic service, and I heard from Edwards at the golf club that she mentioned investments to him. How very curious, Miss Marple said, and her manner when she arrived today was rather singular for someone whose employee had just been found dead. Wasn't it just, Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, not a tear or a tremor, more annoyed about having to find a new lady's maid than concerned about the poor girl. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who looked no more pleased than he had earlier. Colonel, Mrs. Bantry, he acknowledged with a curt nod, his eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of Miss Marple placidly knitting in the corner. Miss Marple, still here, I see. Mrs. Bantry has kindly invited me to stay for a few days, Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. Such a difficult time for them both. Inspector Slack looked as if he might object, but instead turned to Colonel Bantry. We've completed our examination of the library for now, sir. The body has been removed to the mortuary. Dr. Haydock will conduct a full autopsy this afternoon. Thank you, Inspector, Colonel Bantry said stiffly. May we use our library again, or is it still considered what do you call it, crime scene? You may use it, but please don't disturb anything more than necessary. We may need to re-examine certain elements. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. Mrs. Fortescue confirms that Lily Bennet had yesterday afternoon and evening off, supposedly to visit her aunt in Danemouth. We're checking with the aunt now, but Mrs. Fortescue seemed unconcerned about the matter. How did she react to the news of her maid's death? Miss Marple inquired innocently. Inspector Slack glanced at her sharply. As one might expect, Miss Marple. Now, If you'll excuse me, I have an investigation to conduct. After he had departed, Miss Marple set aside her knitting. I believe I'll take a little stroll through the garden, if you don't mind, Dolly. The fresh air will do me good, and I might look in at the library on my way out. Of course, Jane, Mrs. Bantry replied. I'd join you, but I really must speak to Mrs. Price about luncheon arrangements. The library at Gossington Hall was a handsome room, with tall windows overlooking the rose garden and bookshelves lining 3 walls. Miss Marple stood in the doorway for a moment, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The hearth rug where the body had been found had been removed, presumably taken away by the police for examination. A faint chalk outline marked the spot where Lily Bennet had lain. Miss Marple crossed to the French windows that led to the terrace. They were locked now, but she noted the sturdy key in the lock. A possible entry point, perhaps. She turned slowly, surveying the room. Nothing seemed disturbed or out of place. Colonel Bantry was meticulous about his library, with books arranged by subject and author. As she was about to leave, Miss Marple paused, her attention caught by something glinting on the carpet near where the body had been found. Bending carefully, she discovered a tiny sequin, the same deep blue as the evening gown Lily Bennet had been wearing, according to Dr. Haydock's description. She pocketed the small find and continued her explorations outside, walking slowly along the gravel path that led from the terrace around the side of the house. Gossington Lodge, the dower house, was visible through the trees, a charming Georgian building of more modest proportions than the Hall. On an impulse, Miss Marple decided to extend her walk in that direction. As she approached Gossington Lodge, she noticed a slender, nervous-looking woman of middle age tending to a flower bed. The woman started violently when Miss Marple spoke. "Good morning. What lovely delphiniums. I'm Jane Marple, staying with the Bantrys at the Hall." "Oh, yes, good morning," the woman stammered, brushing soil from her gardening gloves. "I'm Edith Brewster, Mrs. Fortescue's companion." "How pleasant to have someone to share gardening interests," Miss Marple said, with a warm smile. "I was wondering if Mrs. Fortescue might have a gardening book I've been eager to consult. Hardy perennials for challenging soils. Colonel Bantry mentioned she had an extensive collection." Miss Brewster seemed flustered by this request. I'm not sure. Mrs. Fortescue is rather particular about her books. She's resting now after the shock of this morning's news." "Oh dear, how thoughtless of me," Miss Marple exclaimed. "Of course she would be upset about poor Lily Bennet. Such a tragedy for a young life to be cut short." At the mention of Lily's name, Miss Brewster's hands trembled noticeably. Yes, a terrible thing. Though I hardly knew the girl, of course. Mrs. Fortescue prefers to manage her personal staff directly. "I understand completely," Miss Marple said sympathetically. "Perhaps another time for the book. You must all be quite distressed." "Miss Brewster? Who are you speaking with?" The sharp voice of Mrs. Fortescue cut through the morning air as she appeared on the garden path, as immaculately dressed as she had been earlier, not a hair out of place. "This is Miss Marple, from the village," Miss Brewster explained nervously. "She's staying with the Bantrys and came to inquire about a gardening book." Mrs. Fortescue's pale eyes assessed Miss Marple coldly. "I see. Well, you're welcome to come in, Miss Marple, though I'm afraid my gardening collection is rather limited. Edith, do see about some refreshment for our visitor." Inside, Gossington Lodge revealed Mrs. Fortescue's expensive taste. What had once been a comfortable, if somewhat old-fashioned, dower house had been transformed with sleek modern furniture, abstract art, and luxury textiles. Miss Marple was shown to a sitting room, while Miss Brewster hurried off to organize tea. "You must forgive the disarray," Mrs. Fortescue said, though the room was impeccably tidy. "This dreadful business has thrown the household into chaos. Good ladies' maids are so difficult to find these days." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "Lily Bennet had been with you long." "Just under 3 months. She came with excellent references from a London household." Mrs. Fortescue waved a dismissive hand. "Competent enough with hair and clothing, though somewhat lacking in conversation." Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the mantelpiece, where several silver-framed photographs were arranged. Most showed Mrs. Fortescue in glamorous settings, at a race meeting, on a yacht, at what appeared to be a casino. But partially hidden behind the others was a different sort of image, a younger Mrs. Fortescue beside a distinguished older man in what looked like military uniform. Mrs. Fortescue followed her gaze and moved swiftly to adjust the photographs, effectively hiding the military one from view. "My late husband," she said shortly, "from our time in Hong Kong." "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "Was Mr. Fortescue in the services then?" A flash of something, uncertainty, fear, crossed Mrs. Fortescue's perfectly made-up face. "Diplomatic corps," she said smoothly. "Attached to the military mission there. It was all very hush-hush, you understand. Official Secrets Act and all that." Miss Brewster returned with a tea tray, her hand still visibly shaking as she set it down. Mrs. Fortescue watched her with barely concealed impatience. "Do pour for Miss Marple, Edith, and then see about those letters I asked you to post." As Miss Brewster poured tea with trembling hands, Miss Marple observed the curious dynamic between the two women. Miss Brewster seemed almost terrified of her employer, while Mrs. Fortescue regarded her with the casual disdain one might show a not very efficient servant rather than a companion. "I understand Lily was to visit her aunt yesterday," Miss Marple ventured, accepting a cup of tea. "In Danemouth, was it?" "So she informed me," Mrs. Fortescue replied indifferently. "I don't inquire too closely into my staff's personal affairs, Miss Marple. As long as they return in time for their duties, their free time is their own." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed, "though it does seem strange that she was found dressed for an evening engagement rather than for a family visit." Mrs. Fortescue's cup paused halfway to her lips. "Does it? I couldn't say. Perhaps she had plans after visiting her aunt. A young woman's social life is her own business." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening forcefully, followed by rapid footsteps in the hall. The sitting room door was flung open to reveal a young man in his late 20s, handsome in a disheveled way, his expression thunderous. "Where is it, Victoria?" he demanded without preamble, then stopped short at the sight of Miss Marple. "Oh, I didn't realize you had company." "Peter, what an unexpected surprise," Mrs. Fortescue said, her voice brittle with false warmth. "Miss Marple, may I present my stepson, Peter Fortescue." "Peter, Miss Marple is a neighbor who dropped by to inquire about a gardening book." "How do you do?" Peter said distractedly, barely glancing at Miss Marple. "I need to speak with you urgently, Victoria, in private." "Miss Marple was just leaving," Mrs. Fortescue said pointedly. "Weren't you, Miss Marple?" "Yes, indeed," Miss Marple said, rising with a gentle smile. "Thank you for the tea, Mrs. Fortescue. Perhaps another time for that book." As she was shown out by the still trembling Miss Brewster, Miss Marple distinctly heard Peter Fortescue's voice raised in anger. "What have you done with it? It wasn't yours to take." Miss Marple paused in the hallway, ostensibly adjusting her hatpin while straining to hear Mrs. Fortescue's reply, but Miss Brewster was quick to usher her toward the door. "Mrs. Fortescue values her privacy," Miss Brewster murmured apologetically. "Family matters, you understand." "Of course," Miss Marple said kindly. "These things can be so difficult, especially when unexpected deaths occur." Miss Brewster's pale face grew even paler. "I really must go," she whispered, almost pushing Miss Marple out the door. Back at Gossington Hall, Miss Marple found Inspector Slack waiting to speak with her. His expression suggested it was not a social call. "Miss Marple," he began without preamble, "I understand you've been asking questions about the deceased and visiting Gossington Lodge." "Dear me," Miss Marple replied innocently. "I was merely taking a morning constitutional and inquiring about a gardening book. Has something happened?" Inspector Slack's stern expression didn't waver. "The autopsy results are in. Lily Bennet died of poison, as Dr. Haydock suspected. And we've learned something else. She never arrived at her aunt's house in Danemouth yesterday." "How very strange," Miss Marple murmured. Furthermore, the inspector continued, we found this among her personal belongings. He produced a small silver compact, obviously expensive and engraved with delicate filigree work that matched the description of the hairpin found in the dead girl's hand. Rather beyond the means of a lady's maid, wouldn't you say? Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. Most illuminating. Inspector Slack pocketed the compact again. I'm warning you, Miss Marple, this is a police investigation. Your interference could compromise important evidence. I wouldn't dream of interfering, Inspector, Miss Marple assured him with her most innocent smile. I'm merely keeping Mrs. Bantry company during this difficult time. After the inspector had departed, Miss Marple retired to the guest room Mrs. Bantry had prepared for her. As she unpinned her hat, she noticed something amiss. The drawer of the small writing desk was slightly ajar, though she was certain she had closed it properly when placing her handkerchief there earlier. A careful examination revealed that someone had been searching through her belongings. Nothing appeared to be missing, but her few items had been moved and hastily replaced. It seemed that Miss Marple's innocent queries had made someone at Gossington Hall very nervous indeed. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Village Shop. Miss Marple was an early riser by habit. She had observed throughout her long life that the morning hours often provided clarity that eluded one at night. The discovery that someone had searched her room at Gossington Hall only confirmed her suspicion that there was far more to Lily Bennet's death than a simple case of murder, if murder could ever be called simple. After a light breakfast, during which Colonel Bantry buried himself behind his newspaper and Mrs. Bantry fretted about the disruption to the household routine, Miss Marple announced her intention to walk into the village. But surely you're not leaving us, Jane? Mrs. Bantry asked in dismay. Only for an hour or two, dear, Miss Marple assured her. There are one or two things I need from the village shop, and I thought I might stop at the post office as well. Well, if you must, Mrs. Bantry sighed, though I can't imagine what you need that couldn't be sent up from the village. Miss Marple smiled gently. It's the little things one misses when away from home. My particular brand of darning wool, you know, and some letter paper. The morning was pleasant, with a light breeze carrying the scent of early roses and newly mown grass. Miss Marple walked briskly along the lane to the village, her mind turning over the events of the previous day. The silver hairpin clutched in Lily Bennet's hand, the matching compact found among her belongings, Mrs. Fortescue's curious reaction to the photograph on her mantelpiece, and Peter Fortescue's angry demand, "What have you done with it?" all suggested that something valuable was at stake. The village shop, run by Mrs. Price and her husband, was the center of St. Mary Mead's informal information network. Its proprietors knew everyone's business, from who ordered what to who owed money on their accounts. Miss Marple had long ago discovered that a conversation with Mrs. Price yielded more useful intelligence than a dozen official interviews. The bell above the door tinkled as Miss Marple entered. Mrs. Price, a stout woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, was arranging a display of tinned goods. "Why, Miss Marple, good morning to you. We heard you were staying up at the Hall after that dreadful business with the body in the library. Terrible thing, isn't it? Poor Colonel and Mrs. Bantry." "Good morning, Mrs. Price," Miss Marple replied. "Yes, it has been quite distressing for them both. I'll need some of my usual darning wool, if you have it in stock, and perhaps a packet of writing paper." As Mrs. Price bustled about gathering the requested items, Miss Marple casually remarked, "Such a tragic thing about that poor young woman, Lily Bennet. I understand she worked for Mrs. Fortescue at Gossington Lodge." Mrs. Price's eyes lit up at the opportunity to discuss the village's most sensational topic. "That she did, Miss Marple. Lady's maid, she was, though if you ask me, there was something not quite right about that arrangement." "Not quite right?" Miss Marple inquired innocently. "In what way?" Mrs. Price leaned across the counter confidentially. "Well, Lily Bennet came to the shop regularly, you know, always very polite, but not like a regular lady's maid at all. For one thing, she had money to spend. Cash, mind you, not just what was on her mistress's account." "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "Perhaps she had savings from previous employment." Maybe so, Mrs. Price conceded, but she was always buying express stamps for letters to London. Not cheap, those are, and she sent them regular as clockwork, every Tuesday. And then there was that package that came for Mrs. Fortescue about a month ago. A package, Miss Marple prompted, when Mrs. Price paused dramatically. Foreign stamps it had, from India or some such place. Mrs. Fortescue came to collect it herself, which she never usually does. Normally sends Lily or that nervous Miss Brewster. When I handed it over, she turned white as a sheet, Miss Marple. White as a sheet, she went. Nearly dropped the thing, she did, and hurried out without so much as a thank you. The bell above the door tinkled again as another customer entered. Miss Weatherby, a thin, angular woman of indeterminate age who lived in one of the cottages near the church and was known for her keen observational skills and love of bird-watching. "Good morning, Mrs. Price, Miss Marple," she greeted them. "Half a pound of tea, if you please, Mrs. Price, and a tin of biscuits. The vicar is calling this afternoon." While Mrs. Price weighed out the tea, Miss Weatherby turned to Miss Marple. "I understand you're staying at Gossington Hall during this dreadful business, Miss Marple. Such a shock for everyone. That poor young woman, Lily Bennet, wasn't it?" "Yes, indeed," Miss Marple replied. "A lady's maid at Gossington Lodge. I believe she was supposed to be visiting her aunt in Danemouth on the evening she died." Miss Weatherby's eyes widened behind her spectacles. "Well, that's most curious, Miss Marple, because I saw Lily Bennet on Wednesday evening. That would have been the night she died, and she certainly wasn't on her way to Danemouth." Both Miss Marple and Mrs. Price looked at her with keen interest. "You saw her, Miss Weatherby?" Miss Marple asked. "Where was this?" "Near the old stone bridge, the one over the stream at the edge of Gossington property," Miss Weatherby replied, clearly enjoying her moment in the spotlight. "I was returning from my evening walk. I often go out at dusk to observe the nightjars, you know, when I saw her walking with a man." "A man?" Mrs. Price exclaimed. "Well, I never. Who was he?" Miss Weatherby shook her head. "I couldn't say for certain. It was growing dark, and they were some distance away, but he was well dressed, I could see that much, wearing a dark suit and hat. They seemed to be having an intense conversation. I thought nothing of it at the time, of course. Young women will have their admirers." "Did they see you, Miss Weatherby?" Miss Marple inquired. "Oh, I don't think so. I was on the path through the copse, and they were on the main road. They turned off toward the old gardener's cottage, you know, the one that's been empty since old Jeffries died last year." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The gardener's cottage stood on Gossington property, but had been vacant for some time. It was secluded and would have provided a private meeting place. After completing her purchases at the shop, Miss Marple made her way to the post office, where Miss Trollope, the postmistress, greeted her with the slightly officious manner she reserved for what she considered official business. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I've been expecting you. Murder in St. Mary Mead. It's just like one of those detective stories my niece is always reading." "Good morning, Miss Trollope," Miss Marple replied mildly. "I've come to post a letter to my nephew Raymond." She produced an envelope addressed to Raymond West, Esquire, in London. As Miss Trollope weighed the letter and calculated the postage, Miss Marple remarked casually, "I understand that poor Lily Bennet, the young woman who was found dead at Gossington Hall, was in the habit of sending letters to London regularly." Miss Trollope's eyes gleamed with the pleasure of sharing privileged information. "Every Tuesday without fail, Miss Marple. Express delivery too. Always to the same address in London, a P.O. box number, which I thought rather curious, and paid for in cash, not charged to Mrs. Fortescue's account." "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "And Mrs. Fortescue herself, does she receive much correspondence?" Miss Trollope leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Foreign letters, quite often. Some from the continent, others with exotic stamps. India, Hong Kong, places like that. And about 3 weeks ago, there was a letter that upset her terribly." "Upset her?" Miss Marple prompted. "She was collecting her mail, usually has it held here rather than delivered, says it's more convenient. And there was a letter with a London postmark. Plain envelope, typed address. When she saw it, She dropped all her other parcels right there on the counter. Went quite pale, she did, and her hands shook so badly she could hardly pick everything up again. Most peculiar. Miss Marple thanked Miss Trollope for this information and set off back toward Gossington Hall, taking a slight detour that would lead her past the old stone bridge Miss Weatherby had mentioned. It was a pleasant spot, with the stream bubbling beneath and willows drooping gracefully on either bank. The gardener's cottage was visible through the trees, a small sturdy building of weathered stone, now looking somewhat neglected with ivy encroaching on its walls. As she paused to admire the view, Miss Marple became aware of someone approaching along the path from the direction of Gossington Lodge. It was Peter Fortescue, looking less dishevelled than he had the previous day, but no less agitated. He stopped short when he saw Miss Marple. "Oh, Miss Maple, wasn't it?" "Marple," she corrected gently. "Miss Jane Marple. We met briefly yesterday at Gossington Lodge. You're Mrs. Fortescue's stepson, I believe." "That's right." He seemed to hesitate, then appeared to make a decision. "Look, I know you're staying with the Bantrys, and you probably know about what happened to Victoria's maid." "Lily Bennet, yes. A most tragic affair." Peter Fortescue glanced around as if to ensure they were alone. "I think there's more to it than just a random murder, Miss Marple. I think it's connected to my father's death." Miss Marple's faded blue eyes sharpened with interest. "Your father's death, Mr. Fortescue?" "I wasn't aware." Peter nodded grimly. "Colonel James Fortescue, my father. He died in India a year ago, supposedly of heart failure, but I've never believed it was natural. He was in perfect health, and there were circumstances that made me suspicious." "What sort of circumstances?" Miss Marple inquired. Peter ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustrated grief. "My father was stationed in northern India with his regiment. He'd been there during the war, involved in intelligence work, made some powerful friends and dangerous enemies. After the war, he stayed on in an advisory capacity." "And he met your stepmother there?" "Victoria?" "No, he'd known her before. They married just after the war, when he was appointed to his post in India. She went out there with him." Peter's expression darkened. "She was much younger than my father, of course. I was already at Oxford when they married." "I see," Miss Marple said. "And you believe your father's death may not have been from natural causes?" Peter lowered his voice. "I received a letter from him just before he died. He mentioned concerns about certain missing items, valuable items, and hinted that he was investigating something serious. Then suddenly he was dead, and Victoria was making arrangements to return to England with all his effects." "What sort of valuable items, Mr. Fortescue?" Miss Marple asked gently. "My father's regimental silver," Peter replied. "A presentation set given to him by the Maharaja of Rajapur for services during the war. It included some rather distinctive pieces, dress uniform accessories, including hairpins with filigree work in the Rajput style." Miss Marple felt a small thrill of confirmation. The silver hairpin found in Lily Bennet's hand might well be one of these items. "When I heard about my father's death, I tried to get out to India immediately, but there were delays with visas and permits. By the time I arrived, Victoria had already shipped most of his belongings back to England. When I finally caught up with her here, she claimed the silver set was missing, that it must have been stolen before she packed up." "But you don't believe her," Miss Marple suggested. "I know she's lying," Peter said bitterly. "My father valued that set enormously. He would never have allowed it to be stolen. And now this girl, Lily Bennet, is found dead, with what sounds like one of the hairpins from that very set. It can't be a coincidence." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Coincidences of that nature are rare indeed. Have you shared your suspicions with Inspector Slack?" Peter gave a short laugh. "I tried. He wasn't interested in what he called family squabbles over inheritance. He thinks Lily Bennet's death is connected to some local intrigue, a lover's quarrel, or something equally mundane." Miss Marple was about to respond when she noticed a car with London number plates parked on the road beyond the bridge. As they watched, a man raised what appeared to be binoculars, studying them intently, then quickly started the engine and drove away. "How very odd," Miss Marple remarked. "Did you recognize that car, Mr. Fortescue?" Peter frowned. "No, but it's not the first time I've noticed it around the village. I saw the same vehicle yesterday, parked near the church." "Indeed. Most curious." Peter glanced at his watch. "I should be getting back. I told Victoria I was going for a walk to clear my head. She doesn't know I've been making inquiries." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "But Mr. Fortescue, if you have any further information that might shed light on this matter, I'd be most interested to hear it." "You believe me then?" Peter asked, sounding surprised. "I believe that coincidences are rare," Miss Marple replied carefully, "and that silver hairpins of unusual design don't often find their way into the hands of ladies' maids unless there's a reason for it." As Peter Fortescue strode away toward Gossington Lodge, Miss Marple continued her walk back to the hall, her mind busy with new information. The connection to India was significant, as was the mention of the regimental silver. And now there was the additional mystery of the London car with its observer. Someone was watching developments in St. Mary Mead very closely indeed. Upon her return to Gossington Hall, Miss Marple found a police car parked in the drive. Inside, she discovered Inspector Slack in the drawing room with Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, his expression even more severe than usual. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said when she entered. "I was just informing Colonel and Mrs. Bantry of a new development. Miss Brewster, Mrs. Fortescue's companion, has been found unconscious in the garden at Gossington Lodge. It appears she fell or was pushed from an upper window." Chapter 4. The Doctor's Testimony. "Pushed from a window?" Mrs. Bantry gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "You mean there's been another attempt at murder?" Inspector Slack's expression remained impassive. "We can't say for certain yet, Mrs. Bantry. Miss Brewster has been taken to the cottage hospital. Dr. Haydock is with her now." "Is her condition serious?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Concussion, broken arm, possible internal injuries," Inspector Slack replied. "She's unconscious, but Dr. Haydock believes she'll survive." "How terrible," Colonel Bantry said, shaking his head. "First a murder in our library, and now this. What on earth is happening in St. Mary Mead?" "That's what we intend to find out, Colonel," Inspector Slack said grimly. "I've called a meeting at the police station for 11 o'clock. Dr. Haydock will present his findings from the autopsy on Lily Bennet, and will review the evidence collected so far. I'd like all of you to attend." "Us?" Mrs. Bantry looked startled. "But surely we can't be of any help." "On the contrary," Inspector Slack said, "you might recognize details that seem insignificant to others. And Miss Marple," he added with a pointed look, "seems to have been conducting her own inquiries. I'd rather have her insights shared officially than circulating as village gossip." "How very sensible, Inspector," Miss Marple murmured, ignoring the implied criticism. "I'd be most happy to assist in any way I can." The police station in St. Mary Mead was a modest brick building that also housed the local magistrate's court. By 11 o'clock, a small group had assembled in the main office. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple, Peter Fortescue, looking pale and worried, and Mrs. Fortescue, who had arrived in a cloud of expensive perfume, dressed as if for a luncheon in London rather than a police inquiry in a village murder case. Dr. Haydock arrived last, carrying a leather document case and looking grave. Miss Marple observed him with interest. A man in his 60s with a weathered face and steady hands, he had been the local physician for many years and was generally respected for his competence and discretion. Today, however, there was a tension about him that suggested he was uncomfortable with the proceedings. "Thank you all for coming," Inspector Slack began formally. "Dr. Haydock will present his medical findings first, then we'll discuss the additional evidence and any relevant information you may have." Dr. Haydock cleared his throat and opened his case, removing a typewritten report. "The autopsy on Lily Bennet confirms that death was caused by poisoning, as I initially suspected. The poison in question is a rare compound derived from a plant found primarily in northern India and parts of Nepal. It's known locally as Mara Fall, death flower, and was historically used by certain sects for ritualistic executions. How extraordinary, Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. Why would anyone use such an exotic poison in St. Mary Mead? That's precisely the question, Mrs. Bantry, Inspector Slack said. Dr. Haydock, please continue. The poison was administered in liquid form, most likely in a drink. It works rapidly, causing paralysis followed by respiratory failure within minutes. The victim would have been conscious but unable to call for help or move. How awful, Mrs. Bantry whispered. And you're certain of this particular poison, Doctor? Miss Marple asked gently. It seems rather unusual. Dr. Haydock hesitated fractionally before answering. I am certain, Miss Marple. I encountered a similar case during my time in India. I served with the Royal Army Medical Corps during the war and stayed on for several years afterward. The symptoms are quite distinctive. You served in India, Doctor? Haydock? Peter Fortescue leaned forward with sudden interest. Might I ask where you were stationed? The northern provinces, primarily, Dr. Haydock replied, his discomfort visibly increasing. Mainly around Delhi and Simla, but I traveled extensively. Perhaps you knew my father then, Peter pressed. Colonel James Fortescue. He was stationed in northern India after the war as well. Dr. Haydock's face paled slightly. Yes, I believe our paths crossed briefly. The colonel was well respected in the region. Miss Marple observed this exchange with keen interest. Dr. Haydock's reaction suggested more than a casual acquaintance with Colonel Fortescue. Inspector Slack cleared his throat impatiently. If we could return to the matter at hand, Dr. Haydock, what can you tell us about the silver hairpin found in the victim's possession? Dr. Haydock produced a small evidence bag containing the hairpin. As you can see, it's an unusual piece. The silver work is distinctively Rajput in style, from Rajasthan in northern India. Such items are typically part of ceremonial dress or presentation sets given to honored guests or officials. Our technical department confirms it's genuine silver of high quality, probably dating from the 1930s or 40s. May I? Peter Fortescue asked, reaching for the bag. Inspector Slack nodded, and Peter examined the hairpin closely. This is from my father's regimental set, he confirmed, his voice tight with emotion. It was given to him by the Maharaja of Rajapur for services during the war. The set included cufflinks, dress studs, and 4 of these hairpins, which were meant to secure a ceremonial turban. Mrs. Fortescue shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Really, Peter, I don't see how you can be certain. It's just a silver hairpin. I grew up seeing this set in my father's study, Peter replied coldly. I know every piece intimately, and the Maharaja's craftsman incorporated a tiny maker's mark. If you look closely at the base of the pin, you'll see a miniature lotus flower engraved there. Inspector Slack took the bag back and examined the hairpin. He's right, there is a small mark here. Which brings us to the next piece of evidence, he continued, producing another evidence bag containing the silver compact found among Lily Bennett's possessions. This compact was discovered in the victim's room at Gossington Lodge. It appears to be of similar workmanship to the hairpin. Peter Fortescue nodded grimly. It's from the same set. There were several small items intended for a lady. This compact, a perfume bottle, a small pill box. Mrs. Fortescue's perfectly manicured hands clenched in her lap. This is absurd. How would Lily Bennett have obtained these items? I certainly never gave them to her. That is the question, isn't it? Inspector Slack said. Mrs. Fortescue, you claim that your late husband's silver set went missing in India before his effects were shipped back to England. Yet pieces from that very set have turned up in the possession of your lady's maid. I can't explain it, Mrs. Fortescue said, her voice hard. Perhaps she stole them. Perhaps she was working with whoever took the set originally. Or perhaps, Peter Fortescue interjected, the set never went missing at all. Perhaps you brought it back to England yourself, Victoria. The tension in the room was palpable. Mrs. Fortescue's pale eyes flashed with anger. How dare you? I've told you repeatedly that the set disappeared before I left India. If you're suggesting I had anything to do with your father's precious silver—" "I'm suggesting," Peter interrupted, "that you've lied about many things, including the circumstances of my father's death." Inspector Slack rapped sharply on the desk. "That's enough. We're here to discuss Lily Bennett's murder and the attack on Miss Brewster, not to revisit family disagreements." "But they may be connected, Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly. "If Lily Bennett somehow discovered or came into possession of items from this silver set, and if those items are somehow linked to Colonel Fortescue's death, it would provide a motive for her murder." Inspector Slack looked skeptical, but nodded for her to continue. "Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple turned to the physician, "you mentioned that you recognized the poison because you had seen a similar case in India. Might I ask when and where that was?" Dr. Haydock hesitated, visibly uncomfortable with the question. "It was in Delhi in 1948. A British officer was found dead in his quarters. The symptoms were identical." "And was the case solved?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "No," Dr. Haydock admitted. "It was officially recorded as death by unknown causes. There was political pressure to avoid a scandal." Peter Fortescue leaned forward intently. "This officer, was it my father? Was Colonel Fortescue poisoned?" Dr. Haydock looked stricken. I can't discuss that. Medical confidentiality." "Doctor," Inspector Slack interrupted, "if you have information relevant to a murder investigation, you are legally obliged to share it." Dr. Haydock's shoulders slumped in defeat. It wasn't Colonel Fortescue. It was another officer in the same regiment, but the circumstances were similar. "And Colonel Fortescue's death?" Peter insisted. "Was that truly heart failure?" "I wasn't his attending physician when he died," Dr. Haydock said carefully. "I had already returned to England by then." Inspector Slack tapped his pencil impatiently. "Let's return to the evidence at hand. Our forensic team found Lily Bennett's fingerprints on both the hairpin and the compact, confirming they were in her possession. We also found traces of the poison on a glass in Mrs. Fortescue's study at Gossington Lodge." Mrs. Fortescue gasped. "In my study? That's impossible. I never offered Lily a drink there." "When was Lily Bennett last seen alive?" Miss Marple asked. "According to household staff at Gossington Lodge, she left the house around 3 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon, ostensibly to visit her aunt in Danemouth," Inspector Slack replied. "Mrs. Fortescue confirms this, as does the housekeeper. However, the aunt states that Lily never arrived." "She was seen later that evening near the old stone bridge," Miss Marple offered. "Miss Weatherby observed her walking with a well-dressed man around dusk. They appeared to be heading toward the abandoned gardener's cottage on Gossington property." "And you're only mentioning this now?" Inspector Slack demanded. "I only learned of it this morning, Inspector," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Miss Weatherby mentioned it when I encountered her at the village shop." "We'll need to interview Miss Weatherby and search that cottage immediately," Inspector Slack said, making a note. "Now, regarding Miss Brewster's fall, is she conscious yet?" Colonel Bantry inquired. "She regained consciousness briefly at the hospital," Dr. Haydock replied. "She managed to say a few words before lapsing back into unconsciousness." "What did she say?" Peter Fortescue asked urgently. Dr. Haydock glanced at Inspector Slack, who nodded for him to continue. "She mentioned the Colonel's papers and the silver set. She seemed very agitated, saying something about them being the proof before she lost consciousness again." "The Colonel's papers?" Peter echoed. "What papers?" "That's what we intend to find out," Inspector Slack said grimly. "Mrs. Fortescue, did your husband leave any significant documents or papers in your possession?" Mrs. Fortescue's composure slipped momentarily. "James was involved in classified work. Many of his papers were official documents that I returned to the War Office after his death. Anything else was personal correspondence that I've kept private, as is my right." "And Miss Brewster? What was her relationship to your late husband?" Miss Marple inquired innocently. Mrs. Fortescue's eyes narrowed. "Edith never met James. I employed her after I returned to England last year." Yet she seems to know something about the Colonel's papers, Miss Marple pointed out. How curious. Inspector, Dr. Haydock interjected. There's one more thing about the silver hairpin that may be significant. Our technical department discovered that it had been modified slightly. The solid silver shaft has been hollowed out, creating a small compartment inside the ornamental head. A compartment? Inspector Slack looked startled. Was anything found inside it? No, it was empty, Dr. Haydock replied. But such a modification suggests it was intended to conceal something small, a microfilm perhaps, or a tightly rolled document. Peter Fortescue's expression turned triumphant. There. That proves it. My father was involved in intelligence work. He must have been using pieces from the silver set to transport or hide sensitive information. Victoria must have known about it. This is preposterous, Mrs. Fortescue snapped. I knew nothing about any modifications to James's silver set, and I certainly don't know what happened to it. It disappeared in India, as I've said repeatedly. Yet pieces from it have appeared here in St. Mary Mead, Inspector Slack observed dryly. In the possession of your lady's maid, who has been murdered with a poison from northern India. And now your companion has had a suspicious fall after apparently mentioning the Colonel's papers and this same silver set. Mrs. Fortescue rose to her feet, her composure cracking. I don't have to sit here and listen to these insinuations. If you wish to question me further, Inspector, you may do so through my solicitor. As she swept toward the door, Inspector Slack called after her. I advise you not to leave the area, Mrs. Fortescue. We may need to speak with you again, very soon. The door closed firmly behind her, leaving an uncomfortable silence in the room. Inspector, Miss Marple said, after a moment, I think it might be wise to examine Dr. Haydock's connection to Colonel Fortescue a bit more thoroughly. They seem to have known each other better than the doctor initially indicated. Dr. Haydock paled visibly. I served in the same region as Colonel Fortescue, that's all. Our paths crossed occasionally in an official capacity. Yet you recognized a rare poison from that region, Miss Marple pressed gently, and you seem quite familiar with the circumstances of another officer's death by that same poison. I was the medical officer called to examine the body, Dr. Haydock admitted reluctantly. It was a case that stayed with me because of its unusual nature. And Colonel Fortescue? Was he involved in the investigation of that death? Miss Marple asked. Dr. Haydock hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yes, he was conducting an internal investigation within the regiment. There were allegations of corruption involving military funds and smuggled artifacts. The officer who died had been implicated. Did my father ever mention his findings to you? Peter Fortescue asked eagerly. Dr. Haydock's eyes flicked nervously to Inspector Slack, then back to Peter. I think it would be best if we discuss this privately, Mr. Fortescue. There are matters of official secrecy involved. I'm afraid that's not possible, Doctor, Inspector Slack said firmly. If you have information relevant to this investigation, it needs to be shared now. Dr. Haydock looked deeply uncomfortable. Very well. Shortly before his death, Colonel Fortescue entrusted certain documents to me for safekeeping. He believed there was corruption within his regiment involving stolen military funds and smuggled artifacts. He had compiled evidence but feared it might be discovered before he could present it to the proper authorities. And these documents? Inspector Slack prompted. I brought them back to England with me when I returned, Dr. Haydock said quietly. The Colonel asked me to deliver them to the War Office if anything happened to him. When I learned of his death, I attempted to do so, but there were complications. The officer to whom I was instructed to deliver the papers had been transferred. I decided to keep them secure until I could determine the proper course of action. So you still have these documents? Peter Fortescue asked incredulously. They're in a safe place, Dr. Haydock confirmed. I believe that was what the Colonel would have wanted. But recently, I've had the sense of being watched, followed. And then Lily Bennet was murdered with a poison I recognized from India, and now Miss Brewster has been attacked. I think, Miss Marple said gently, that it's time those documents were examined, Doctor. They may hold the key to understanding these terrible events. Chapter 5, Knitting Together the Clues. Back at Gossington Hall, Miss Marple sat by the window of her guest room, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she contemplated the morning's revelations. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape, though the complete picture remained tantalizingly obscure. Her contemplation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was Mrs. Bantry, looking flustered. "Jane, you'll never guess what's happened now. Mrs. Fortescue has announced that she's leaving for London immediately. Says she has urgent business that can't wait." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Indeed? That seems rather precipitate, given the circumstances." "Inspector Slack thinks so too. He's on his way over to Gossington Lodge now to question her further. He's quite annoyed about it." "I imagine he would be," Miss Marple murmured. "Has Dr. Haydock shared the documents he mentioned at the meeting?" "Not yet. He said he needed to retrieve them from a secure location. Peter Fortescue went with him. Quite insisted on it, actually." Mrs. Bantry hesitated. "Jane, do you really think these dreadful events are connected to something that happened in India years ago?" "It does seem likely," Miss Marple replied, resuming her knitting. "The poison, the silver hairpin with its hidden compartment, the references to Colonel Fortescue's papers, it all points to a matter that began in India and has followed those involved to St. Mary Mead." Mrs. Bantry shivered slightly. "It's like something out of a novel. I can't believe it's happening here, in our quiet little village." "Human nature is much the same everywhere, Dolly," Miss Marple observed. "Greed, fear, jealousy, the desire to hide one's misdeeds, these things exist in St. Mary Mead, just as they do in London or Delhi." "I suppose you're right," Mrs. Bantry sighed. "But what about poor Lily Bennet? How does she fit into all this?" "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Lily Bennet discovered something she was not meant to know. The regular payments to her account that Inspector Slack mentioned suggest she was either being paid for her silence or was involved in whatever scheme is at the center of these events." "And the silver hairpin? The one found in her hand?" "That, I think, may have been the key to everything," Miss Marple replied, "though not in the way one might initially assume." Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled, but before Miss Marple could elaborate, they were interrupted by Colonel Bantry calling up the stairs. "Dolly, Inspector Slack is here again, and he's brought that chap from London with him, the one Peter Fortescue has been trying to contact." Mrs. Bantry and Miss Marple exchanged glances before hurrying downstairs. In the drawing room, they found Inspector Slack looking grim, and Colonel Bantry nervously offering refreshments to a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, immaculately dressed in a well-cut suit. "Ah, Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple," Inspector Slack said. "This is Major Richards from the War Office in London. He's come down to assist with our investigation." "Major Richards?" Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "I believe Lily Bennet was sending regular letters to London, according to Miss Trollope at the post office. Might they have been addressed to you, Major?" Major Richards gave her an appraising look. "They were indeed, Miss Marple. I see Inspector Slack was right about your powers of observation. Yes, Lily Bennet has been corresponding with me for the past 2 months, providing information about certain items that went missing in India last year." "Items belonging to Colonel Fortescue," Miss Marple suggested. "Among other things," Major Richards confirmed. "I was a colleague of James Fortescue in India. We worked together on several sensitive matters, including the investigation he was conducting within his regiment." "The corruption case Dr. Haydock mentioned," Colonel Bantry said, looking intrigued despite his evident discomfort with the situation. "Precisely." Major Richards accepted the chair Colonel Bantry offered. James had discovered evidence of a smuggling operation run by someone high in the regiment. Military transports were being used to move valuable artifacts out of India. Ancient treasures mostly, that rightfully belonged to the Indian people and should have been protected under the transition of power. "And military funds were involved as well?" Miss Marple inquired. "Yes, substantial sums were being diverted to finance the operation and bribe officials. James was close to identifying the mastermind when he died suddenly." "You suspected his death wasn't natural," Miss Marple stated, rather than asked. Major Richards nodded grimly. James was in perfect health. His heart failure came too conveniently for it to be coincidence, but I had no proof, and with the political situation in India being what it was at the time, there was pressure to avoid any suggestion of foul play involving British officers. So how did Lily Bennet become involved? Mrs. Bantry asked, clearly fascinated by these revelations. That was pure chance, Major Richards replied. She was employed as lady's maid to Mrs. Fortescue, who had brought most of her late husband's effects back to England. Lily discovered the silver compact while cleaning her mistress's room and recognized its value. She mentioned it to her aunt, who happens to be a former housekeeper for my family. The aunt suggested Lily contact me. And she began sending you information about other items from the set, Miss Marple suggested. Yes, she reported finding several pieces over time, all hidden among Mrs. Fortescue's personal belongings. The silver hairpin was the most recent discovery. She wrote to me last Tuesday, saying she had found it and believed there was something concealed inside it. We arranged to meet on Wednesday evening. At the old gardener's cottage, Miss Marple said quietly. Major Richards looked surprised. You know about that? Miss Weatherby observed Lily walking with a well-dressed man near the old stone bridge on Wednesday evening, Miss Marple explained. They appeared to be heading toward the gardener's cottage. That was indeed our meeting place, Major Richards confirmed. I arrived at the appointed time, but Lily never appeared. I waited for an hour, then returned to my hotel in Market Basing. The next morning, I learned of her death. This is all most illuminating, Inspector Slack said, clearly annoyed that so much information had been withheld from him. But it would have been helpful, Major Richards, if you had come forward with this information immediately. I was under orders to proceed with caution, Major Richards replied stiffly. The matter involved sensitive issues of national security. It was only when I learned of the attack on Miss Brewster that I received authorization to cooperate fully with the local investigation. And what is Miss Brewster's role in all this? Mrs. Bantry asked. That, said Major Richards, is what I'm still trying to determine. At that moment, the telephone rang. Colonel Bantry went to answer it, returning moments later with a worried expression. That was Dr. Haydock. Miss Brewster has regained consciousness and is asking to speak with Miss Marple specifically. Most unusual. With me? Miss Marple looked surprised. How very odd. I've barely exchanged a dozen words with the poor woman. Nevertheless, she's quite insistent, Colonel Bantry said. Dr. Haydock suggests you come to the cottage hospital as soon as possible. He says she's still very weak and may not remain conscious for long. I'll drive you, Inspector Slack said, decisively. And you too, Major Richards. I want to hear what Miss Brewster has to say. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple paused. Dolly, would you be so kind as to look at the library with me before we go? There's something I'd like to check. Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled, but agreed. In the library, Miss Marple went directly to the spot where Lily Bennet's body had been found, kneeling carefully to examine the baseboard near the fireplace. Jane, what on earth are you looking for? Mrs. Bantry asked. I'm not entirely sure, Miss Marple admitted, running her fingers along the wooden baseboard. But it occurred to me that if Lily Bennet was carrying something valuable, something she had arranged to give to Major Richards, and was intercepted before their meeting, she might have hidden it somewhere in this room before she died. But why here? Why not somewhere in Gossington Lodge where she worked? Because, Miss Marple said, her fingers detecting a slight movement in a section of the baseboard. That might have been too obvious a hiding place if she feared discovery. With careful pressure, a small section of the baseboard moved, revealing a cavity behind it. Miss Marple reached in and extracted a sealed envelope. Good heavens, Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. How did you know that was there? I didn't, not with certainty, Miss Marple confessed. But I remembered Colonel Bantry mentioning that the section of the library was once damaged by damp and had to be repaired. Such repairs often leave little spaces behind, and Lily Bennet, working in a great house, would know about such things. What's in the envelope? Mrs. Bantry asked eagerly. Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside were several photographs of what appeared to be official documents, and a letter in a firm, masculine hand addressed to the War Office. "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that we have found at least part of Colonel Fortescue's evidence. This appears to be a letter detailing the smuggling operation he was investigating, along with photographs of supporting documents. We should show this to Inspector Slack and Major Richards immediately." The cottage hospital was a small, tidy building on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead. Miss Brewster had been placed in a private room with a uniformed constable stationed outside the door, a precaution Inspector Slack had insisted upon after her suspicious fall. Dr. Haydock greeted them in the corridor. "She's been asking for you, Miss Marple. She's very weak but lucid. Try not to tire her." Miss Marple nodded, handing the envelope they had discovered to Inspector Slack. "You and Major Richards should examine these while I speak with Miss Brewster. They may be relevant to what she has to tell us." Inside the room, Miss Brewster lay propped against pillows, her face pale and drawn, one arm in a cast. Her eyes, however, were alert and fixed on Miss Marple as she entered. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "thank you for coming. I don't have much time." "You're going to be quite all right, my dear," Miss Marple assured her, taking a seat beside the bed. "Dr. Haydock says you're making good progress." Miss Brewster shook her head weakly. "Not that kind of time. She'll try again when she discovers I'm still alive. I need to tell someone the truth, and you seem to be the one who notices things." "About Mrs. Fortescue," Miss Marple suggested gently. Miss Brewster nodded. "She's not who she claims to be. Her real name is Victoria Chambers. She was a secretary at the regimental headquarters in Delhi. That's how she met Colonel Fortescue." "I see," Miss Marple said. "And she was involved in the smuggling operation he was investigating." Miss Brewster's eyes widened in surprise. "You know about that?" "Certain details have come to light," Miss Marple replied. "But I'd very much like to hear your version of events, Miss Brewster." "I was also a secretary there," Miss Brewster said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I worked alongside Victoria. I discovered what she was doing, altering transport manifests, redirecting military shipments. When I confronted her, she offered me money to keep quiet. I was foolish enough to accept." "And you've been in her power ever since," Miss Marple said sympathetically. Miss Brewster nodded miserably. "When Colonel Fortescue began investigating, Victoria seduced him, then married him to monitor his progress. When he got too close to the truth, she poisoned him." "With the same poison that killed Lily Bennet," Miss Marple suggested. "Yes. Victoria had connections to a local who supplied rare herbs and compounds. After the colonel died, she searched for his evidence but couldn't find it all. She knew he had hidden documents somewhere and suspected he had concealed microfilm in pieces of his silver set. That's why she was so desperate to find it. And Lily Bennet discovered some of these pieces while working as Mrs. Fortescue's maid," Miss Marple prompted. "Yes. Victoria was furious when she realized Lily had found the silver compact. She suspected Lily had taken it but couldn't accuse her without revealing its importance. Then she discovered Lily was in contact with someone in London. She intercepted one of Lily's letters to Major Richards," Miss Marple guessed. Miss Brewster looked impressed. "Yes, exactly. She followed Lily on Wednesday evening and saw her meet with a man near the old stone bridge. Victoria confronted Lily when she returned to Gossington Lodge, demanding to know what she had given him. When Lily denied giving him anything, she put the poison in a glass of wine. I saw it happen, but I was too afraid to intervene." "And the silver hairpin that was found in Lily's hand?" Miss Marple asked. "Lily had it with her when she returned. She was clutching it in her pocket. After she collapsed, Victoria tried to take it from her, but couldn't pry it from her fingers. She decided to move the body to Gossington Hall to divert suspicion." "And you helped her," Miss Marple said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. Tears welled in Miss Brewster's eyes. "God forgive me, yes. I was terrified she would kill me too if I refused. We used Victoria's car to transport the body late at night. Colonel Bantry had mentioned at a village event that he always locked the library at 11 before retiring, so Victoria knew the room would be empty. She had a key to the French windows that she'd obtained months ago. She likes to be prepared, you see." And yesterday? What led to your fall from the window? I told Victoria I couldn't live with the guilt anymore, Miss Brewster whispered. That I was going to the police. She flew into a rage. I tried to run, but she caught me near the upstairs gallery window. She pushed me. The last thing I remember is falling. Miss Marple patted Miss Brewster's hand gently. You've been very brave to tell me all this. Now you must rest while we ensure your safety. As she rose to leave, Miss Brewster caught her hand weakly. There's one more thing. The Colonel's papers, the ones he hid. Victoria believes Dr. Haydock has them. That's why she came to St. Mary Mead in the first place. To find them. I understand, Miss Marple said. Thank you for your honesty, Miss Brewster. Outside in the corridor, she found Inspector Slack, Major Richards, and Dr. Haydock deep in conversation over the documents discovered behind the baseboard in the library. These photographs match some of the documents James entrusted to me, Dr. Haydock was saying. He must have made duplicates as insurance. Miss Brewster has confirmed our suspicions, Miss Marple informed them. Mrs. Fortescue, or rather Victoria Chambers, as she was known in India, was indeed involved in the smuggling operation. She married Colonel Fortescue to monitor his investigation and eventually poisoned him when he discovered the truth. And she killed Lily Bennet for finding the silver hairpin, Inspector Slack added grimly. Yes, and attempted to kill Miss Brewster when she threatened to go to the police, Miss Marple confirmed. I believe we now have sufficient evidence to arrest Mrs. Fortescue. There's just one problem, Inspector Slack said. When I went to Gossington Lodge earlier, Mrs. Fortescue had already left. She told the housekeeper she was going to London on urgent business and would return tomorrow. She's running, Major Richards said. Now that Miss Brewster has survived and might talk, she won't risk staying in St. Mary Mead. We've put out an alert to all stations between here and London, Inspector Slack assured them. She won't get far. I wonder, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, if she's going to London at all. If she suspects that Dr. Haydock has the Colonel's papers and that Miss Brewster might reveal her secrets, she might decide that her best course of action is to eliminate both threats before fleeing. Dr. Haydock paled visibly. The papers are in my home, in a hidden safe. If she knows that ... Where is Peter Fortescue? Miss Marple asked suddenly. Wasn't he with you earlier, Doctor? He was, Dr. Haydock confirmed. But you received a telephone call at my house and left abruptly. Said it was from his stepmother, asking to meet him at Gossington Lodge to discuss a settlement regarding his father's estate. A trap, Major Richards said grimly. She means to silence him too. We must return to Gossington Lodge immediately, Inspector Slack declared. Dr. Haydock, you'll remain here under police protection until Mrs. Fortescue is apprehended. As they hurried to the police car, Miss Marple's mind was racing. The pieces of the puzzle had almost all fallen into place, but there was still something nagging at her. Something about the silver hairpin and its position in Lily Bennet's hand that seemed significant. And then, as Inspector Slack started the engine, the final connection suddenly became clear. Oh, she exclaimed softly. Of course. How could I have been so blind? What is it, Miss Marple? Major Richards asked. The silver hairpin, she said urgently. We've been looking at it all wrong. It wasn't placed in Lily's hand by the killer as a message or warning, as Inspector Slack initially suggested. What do you mean? Inspector Slack asked impatiently. Lily Bennet was clutching that hairpin when she died, Miss Marple explained. Not because she was trying to keep it from Mrs. Fortescue, but because she was trying to protect the evidence hidden inside it. Evidence she was bringing to Major Richards when she was intercepted. But the hairpin was empty when we examined it, Inspector Slack pointed out. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, which means someone removed whatever was hidden inside it after Lily's death. Someone who knew exactly what to look for. Chapter 6, The Final Revelation. The scene at Gossington Hall that evening was one Miss Marple would recall for many years to come. Inspector Slack, displaying an efficiency that belied his name, had arranged for all the key figures in the case to gather in the Bantry's drawing room. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry played hosts with a mixture of trepidation and excitement. Dr. Haydock sat somewhat uncomfortably near the fireplace. Major Richard stood alert by the window, and Peter Fortescue, who had indeed narrowly escaped the trap set by his stepmother, paced restlessly across the carpet. Mrs. Fortescue herself sat rigidly in an armchair, flanked by two constables. She had been apprehended attempting to board the London train at Market Basing Station, carrying a suitcase containing not only clothes, but several pieces of the missing silver set, and a passport in a different name. "I still don't understand why you've gathered us all here," Mrs. Fortescue said coldly. "I've denied the preposterous accusations made against me, and I insist on speaking with my solicitor immediately." "All in good time, Mrs. Fortescue," Inspector Slack replied. "Or should I call you Miss Chambers? We have some matters to clarify first." Mrs. Bantry, at Miss Marple's suggestion, had arranged for a display of Colonel Bantry's military memorabilia on a side table, including several regimental pins and badges. Miss Marple's eyes kept returning to this display as the conversation proceeded. "Miss Marple," Inspector Slack continued, "has been instrumental in piecing together the evidence in this case. I've asked her to share her understanding of events with us." Miss Marple cleared her throat gently. "It all began in India," she said, "where Colonel James Fortescue discovered evidence of corruption within his regiment. Someone high in the command was using military resources to smuggle valuable artifacts out of the country. A most reprehensible betrayal of trust." Peter Fortescue nodded grimly. "My father was a man of integrity. He couldn't stand by and allow such corruption to continue." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed. "He gathered evidence meticulously, documenting the altered transport manifests, the diverted funds, the connections to dealers in London who sold the artifacts on the black market. But he knew his investigation had been discovered and that he was in danger. So he entrusted copies of his evidence to Dr. Haydock," Major Richards interjected, "and concealed additional documentation in the silver regimental set." "Yes," Miss Marple confirmed. "The silver hairpins, with their hollow shafts, were perfect for concealing microfilm. The compact, with its false bottom, could hide documents. Colonel Fortescue distributed the evidence in case any single piece was discovered. And when he got too close to identifying the mastermind behind the operation," Inspector Slack said, "he was poisoned." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm, "by the rare compound from northern India that Dr. Haydock recognized, the same poison later used to kill Lily Bennet." Mrs. Fortescue's face remained impassive, though her knuckles whitened as she gripped the arms of her chair. "After Colonel Fortescue's death," Miss Marple continued, "his widow returned to England with his effects, searching desperately for the evidence he had hidden. She knew it implicated her, you see. My stepmother was part of the smuggling ring all along," Peter Fortescue said bitterly. "She married my father to spy on his investigation." "Victoria Chambers was more than just part of the ring," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Miss Brewster's testimony confirms that she was responsible for altering the transport manifests and redirecting shipments. But the question remained, who was the mastermind behind the operation? Who had the authority to organize such an elaborate scheme?" Miss Marple's gaze moved deliberately to Dr. Haydock, who shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "When Lily Bennet discovered pieces of the silver set while working as Mrs. Fortescue's maid," Miss Marple continued, "she recognized their value and reached out to Major Richards, whom she contacted through her aunt. She began sending him information about what she had found. She was a brave young woman," Major Richards said solemnly. "Her letters were cautious at first, but as she gained confidence in me, she revealed more details. The silver hairpin was her most significant discovery," Miss Marple said. "She found it hidden in Mrs. Fortescue's personal jewelry case and realized from its hollow shaft that it contained something important. She arranged to meet Major Richards at the old gardener's cottage to give it to him. But she never arrived at our meeting," Major Richards added. "Now we know why." "Mrs. Fortescue had intercepted one of Lily's letters," Inspector Slack explained. She followed her that evening and saw her meet briefly with Major Richards near the stone bridge. When Lily returned to Gossington Lodge, Mrs. Fortescue confronted her, demanding to know what she had given him. When Lily denied giving him anything, Miss Marple continued, Mrs. Fortescue poisoned her with a glass of wine. But Lily, realizing what had happened as the poison took effect, clutched the silver hairpin tightly, determined that the evidence it contained should not fall into the wrong hands. And after her death, Peter Fortescue said, Victoria and Miss Brewster moved her body to the Bantryses' library to divert suspicion. Yes, Miss Marple confirmed, but there was one detail that puzzled me from the beginning. The silver hairpin was still clutched in Lily's hand when her body was discovered, yet we later learned it had been emptied of its contents. Who had removed the microfilm, and when? All eyes turned to Mrs. Fortescue, who merely raised an eyebrow disdainfully. It couldn't have been Mrs. Fortescue, Miss Marple said, surprising everyone. She had tried and failed to pry the hairpin from Lily's hand after she died, so who had access to the body after it was discovered but before it was examined? A tense silence fell over the room as the implication of her words sank in. Dr. Haydock's face had gone very pale. Dr. Haydock, Miss Marple said quietly, was the first medical professional to examine Lily's body. He noted the unusual silver hairpin and its significance, and he would have recognized it as part of Colonel Fortescue's set immediately. That's absurd, Doctor. Haydock protested weakly. I was a friend of James Fortescue. I helped protect his evidence. You protected some of his evidence, Miss Marple corrected. The documents he gave you directly. But you needed to find and destroy anything that implicated you personally. You? Peter Fortescue exclaimed in disbelief. You were the mastermind behind the smuggling operation. Dr. Haydock's professional composure crumbled. You don't understand, he said hoarsely. After the war, with India gaining independence, countless historical treasures were at risk of being lost or destroyed. I was merely preserving them. By stealing them, Major Richards said coldly. By ensuring they reach collectors who would value them properly, Dr. Haydock countered. And yes, I profited from the arrangements. A doctor's salary is modest after all. And the diverted military funds, Inspector Slack demanded. Dr. Haydock's shoulders slumped. Necessary operational expenses. I never intended for anyone to be harmed. When James began investigating, I tried to dissuade him. I valued his friendship. Yet you poisoned him when he discovered your involvement, Miss Marple said softly. That was Victoria's doing, Dr. Haydock protested, pointing at Mrs. Fortescue. She suggested the poison. She administered it. I merely didn't prevent it. Mrs. Fortescue laughed bitterly. How convenient, Henry. You direct the operation, profit the most, and yet somehow manage to keep your hands clean. You were willing enough to participate, Doctor, Haydock retorted, and to marry James as part of our plan. When you came to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple said to Mrs. Fortescue, it was to find the remaining evidence. You knew Dr. Haydock had settled here after returning from India. Yes, Mrs. Fortescue admitted, dropping all pretense. Henry and I had been associates for years. When he retired to this village, I lost track of him. After James died and I couldn't find all the evidence he had hidden, I realized Henry might have it. So I created a reason to come here. By renting Gossington Lodge, Mrs. Bantry said, finally understanding. Exactly, Mrs. Fortescue confirmed. I needed to be close to Henry, to search his home if necessary. But he was cautious, kept his distance publicly. Then Lily Bennet complicated everything by finding pieces of the silver set. And when Miss Brewster threatened to go to the police, Inspector Slack added, you tried to silence her too. Edith was always weak, Mrs. Fortescue said dismissively. I should have dealt with her years ago. The silver hairpin was the final piece, Miss Marple concluded. When Dr. Haydock examined Lily's body, he recognized it immediately and carefully extracted the microfilm it contained. He knew it would implicate him directly. Is this true, Doctor? Inspector Slack demanded. Dr. Haydock sighed deeply. Yes. The microfilm contained photographs of bank transfers to my personal accounts. James had been more thorough than I realized. And the irony, Miss Marple observed, is that if you had both simply allowed Lily Bennet to give the hairpin to Major Richards, you might have escaped detection. Major Richards was primarily interested in solving Colonel Fortescue's murder, not in exposing the full extent of the smuggling operation. But by killing Lily and then attacking Miss Brewster, you drew attention to yourselves and forced us to examine every aspect of the case. A point I made repeatedly, Mrs. Fortescue said acidly, glaring at Dr. Haydock, but Henry insisted the girl had to be silenced. You're both equally culpable, Inspector Slack said firmly. Mrs. Victoria Fortescue, formerly Chambers, and Dr. Henry Haydock, I am arresting you for the murders of Colonel James Fortescue and Lily Bennet, and the attempted murder of Edith Brewster. As the constables led the two conspirators from the room, Peter Fortescue approached Miss Marple. How can I ever thank you, Miss Marple? You've brought justice for my father and for Lily Bennet. It was the silver hairpin that told the tale in the end, Miss Marple replied, with a gentle smile. Designed to hold things in place, yet it ultimately secured the truth that someone had tried desperately to hide. Later that evening, as Miss Marple prepared to return to her cottage, Mrs. Bantry found her in the guest room, packing her belongings. Will you really not stay another night, Jane? She asked. After all the excitement, I thought you might want to rest. Thank you, Dolly, but I think I'll sleep better in my own bed, Miss Marple replied. And there are the herbaceous borders to attend to. One mustn't neglect one's garden, even when solving murders. Mrs. Bantry shook her head in fond exasperation. Only you could equate gardening with murder investigations, Jane. But they're not so very different, you know, Miss Marple observed, folding her shawl neatly. Both require attention to detail, patience, and an understanding of how things grow from small beginnings into something quite significant. Well, I for one am glad to have the library back to normal, Mrs. Bantry declared, though I don't suppose Arthur will ever feel quite the same about reading there again. Time heals most discomforts, Miss Marple assured her, though I wouldn't be surprised if the Colonel develops a sudden interest in detective novels after this experience. As she walked home in the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the case. Human nature, with its capacity for greed, deception, and violence, remained constant, whether in an English village or on the far side of the world. Yet so too did courage, as Lily Bennet had demonstrated, and the persistent quest for justice that had driven Colonel Fortescue to his last days. The silver hairpin, with its hidden compartment, seemed a fitting emblem for the case itself, an ornamental surface concealing darker depths, yet ultimately revealing the truth to those patient enough to look closely. Miss Marple smiled to herself as she opened her garden gate. The roses were coming along splendidly after all.